The conference room had gone silent, the kind of silence that has weight to it, that presses on the ears. Vanessa Cole stood at the head of the table with a printout trembling in her hand, staring at the man in the faded gray jacket sitting at the far end. Her mouth was open, but nothing was coming out. Her eyes moved from his face to the folder in front of him, to the watch on his wrist. The same cheap, scratched watch she had laughed at 3 weeks ago in this very room. Only now she understood. That watch had been on his wrist the day he built the company that owned the building she worked in. "You're—" she started and stopped. "Daniel Reyes," he said, quietly, not unkindly. "We've actually met. Twice. Before you find out how he ended up sitting at that table, and how a woman who ran a marketing firm of 60 employees ended up staring at him like she'd seen a ghost, we have to go back. 3 weeks earlier. Back before any of this had a name." Daniel Reyes's alarm went off at 5:45 every morning, not because he needed to be anywhere that early, but because his daughter Mia liked to negotiate. 5 more minutes, she'd say, every single day, like it was a brand new idea she'd just invented. "You said that 4 minutes ago." "That's why I only need 1 more." He was 38 years old, and most mornings began this way, a small, sleepy war of attrition with an 8-year-old who had inherited her mother's stubbornness and, Daniel privately thought, his own tendency to negotiate everything down to its smallest possible terms. They lived in a 2-bedroom apartment on the north side of the city, the kind of building where the elevator worked most days and the landlord fixed things eventually. Daniel drove a 9-year-old truck with a dent in the rear bumper he'd never bothered to fix. He wore the same 3 flannel shirts in rotation, and on his left watch, every day, without fail, sat a watch that cost him $11 at a hardware store 2 towns over. People noticed the watch. People always noticed the watch. "Dad, why do you still wear that thing?" Mia asked one morning, poking at it while he made her lunch. "It doesn't even have numbers on half of it." "It tells time. That's the whole job description." "Your mom said you used to have a nice watch." Daniel's hands slowed just slightly over the sandwich he was making. It was a small thing, barely a pause, but it was there. "Your mom exaggerated a lot of things," he said, and his voice was light, but there was something underneath it, something old and folded away. "Eat your apple." Mia's mother, Elena, had died 4 years ago, a car accident on a rainy October night, the kind of tragedy that arrives without warning and rearranges everything that comes after it. Daniel didn't talk about it much. He learned that grief, when spoken about too often, started to feel performative, and he had no interest in performing anything. He simply got up every day, made breakfast, dropped Mia at school, went to work, picked her up, made dinner, helped with homework, and did it again. He worked as a facilities consultant for a property management company, not glamorous, not high-paying, but steady, and it let him keep hours flexible enough to be home by 4:30 most days. His co-workers thought of him as pleasant but unremarkable, quiet, the kind of man you forgot was in the room until he said something quietly correct and everyone realized he'd been paying closer attention than anybody else. There were small things if you looked closely. A locked metal box on the top shelf of his closet that Mia had once asked about and been told simply, "Old paperwork, boring stuff." A framed diploma packed away in a box in storage that he'd never once hung on a wall. A way he read contracts, really read them, line by line, circling clauses that seemed disproportionate for a man renewing a 2-year lease on a modest apartment. None of it added up to anything, not on its own. It was just Daniel, quiet, careful, a little too precise about paperwork, a man who wore an $11 watch and drove a dented truck and negotiated bedtime with an 8-year-old every night like it was the most important job in the world. Which, to him, it was. The trouble started on a Tuesday, the way ordinary disasters do, quietly, with no warning music. Daniel's company had just landed a contract to handle facilities consulting for a mid-sized marketing firm called Cole & Vance, a fast-growing agency that had recently moved into a renovated building downtown. Daniel was sent to do the initial walkthrough, inspect the HVAC systems, review the lease terms, flag anything that needed repair before the firm's ownership signed off on the space. He arrived at 9 in the morning in his usual flannel shirt and work boots, carrying a clipboard and a tablet, and was met in the lobby by the firm's founder and CEO, Vanessa Cole. Vanessa was 34, sharp-suited, the kind of woman who had built something real out of nothing and wanted everyone to know it had cost her plenty. She had a habit of sizing people up in the first 3 seconds of meeting them, and Daniel, plain jacket, scuffed boots, cheap watch peeking out from his sleeve, got sized up fast. "You're the facilities guy?" she said, glancing at her phone. "Daniel Reyes. I'm here for the walkthrough." "Right. Try not to track anything on the new carpet. It just went in." She didn't wait for a response. "My assistant will walk you through. I have actual meetings." Actual meetings, the phrase sat there in the air for a second, doing exactly what it was designed to do. Daniel didn't react. He nodded, made a note on his tablet, not about the comment, but about a water stain forming on the ceiling tile above her head that nobody else seemed to have noticed, and got to work. The walkthrough took most of the day. Daniel was thorough, methodical, the kind of thorough that made junior staff nervous because they assumed a man dressed like him wouldn't know what he was looking at and were surprised each time he did. At one point, he paused near a bank of windows and asked an assistant named Priya about the load-bearing wall that had been partially removed during the renovation. "I don't think that's really your department," Priya said carefully, glancing toward Vanessa's office. "The contractor already signed off on that." "Who's the contractor?" "I'd have to check." "Check," Daniel said, gently. "It matters." Later that afternoon, Vanessa swept back through the space with 2 clients trailing behind her, giving them the tour, gesturing at the exposed brick and the sleek conference room like a woman showing off a trophy. She spotted Daniel crouched near an outlet, tablet in hand. "This is our facilities contractor," she said to the clients, in the tone of someone introducing the coffee machine. Then lower to one of them with a small laugh. "Cute watch, right? I think mine cost more than his monthly rent." The clients chuckled politely. Daniel didn't look up right away. He finished the measurement he was taking, wrote it down, and then looked up and met her eyes for exactly 1 second. "Almost done here. I'll have the report to your office by Thursday." He said nothing else. He didn't need Vanessa Cole's approval, and he'd learned a long time ago that some battles weren't worth fighting in front of an 8-year-old's future, because everything he did, every quiet moment of restraint, was in service of getting home to Mia by 4:30, with his dignity still folded neatly where he kept it, private and untouched. But it landed, of course it landed. He was human. Would you have stayed quiet in that room, or would you have said something? Let us know in the comments. We're curious how many of you would have held it in the way Daniel did. The report Daniel submitted that Thursday was 14 pages long and flagged 3 serious issues: the load-bearing wall modification that hadn't been properly permitted, an outdated electrical panel that violated current code, and mold beginning to form behind the water-stained ceiling tile he'd noticed on his first day. It was, by any professional measure, excellent work. It was also deeply inconvenient, because fixing those issues would cost Cole & Vance close to $80,000 and delay their planned expansion by 2 months. Vanessa called Daniel's supervisor directly. "This report is excessive," she said. "It reads like he's trying to justify his invoice. I don't need a novel, I need a checklist." Daniel's supervisor, a soft-spoken man named Frank, who mostly wanted to avoid conflict, called Daniel into his office the next morning. "She wants you to soften it," Frank said, not quite meeting Daniel's eyes. "Maybe reframe the wall issue as a recommendation instead of a violation." "It's not a recommendation, Frank. It's a code violation. If that wall fails, people get hurt." I know that, but she's a big client, Daniel, and she's saying you're being difficult." Daniel sat with that for a moment. He thought about Mia, asleep at home with her nightlight shaped like a crescent moon, and the mortgage-sized rent he paid every month on an apartment that was, by any reasonable measure, smaller than what he could afford if he wanted to make a phone call he hadn't made in 6 years. He thought about how easy it would be to make this problem disappear. "I'll adjust the language," he said finally, "not the findings." He revised the report so the tone was less blunt, kept every finding intact, and sent it back. It didn't matter. 2 weeks later, Vanessa requested a follow-up walkthrough, this time specifically to have Daniel present so she could, in her words, clarify a few things directly with the guy who wrote this. The second walkthrough was worse. She met him in the lobby again, this time with her assistant Priya and 2 members of her leadership team, and made a show of walking slightly ahead of him the entire time, throwing comments back over her shoulder. "You know, in my experience, people who overflag issues are usually trying to make themselves necessary, right? Job security. Find enough problems and you get to keep coming back." "I flag what I find." Sure you do." She stopped near the reception desk, glanced at his wrist, and something in her expression sharpened into something smaller and meaner than before. "You know, I looked you up. Facilities consultant, community college, no LinkedIn presence to speak of. No offense, but I'd feel a lot more confident if this report had come from someone with, I don't know, a little more behind them." Priya shifted uncomfortably beside her. One of the leadership team members looked at his shoes. Daniel held her gaze for a long moment. "The wall is still a problem, Miss Cole. The panel is still a problem. Those don't change based on who's telling you about them." "We'll get a second opinion," she said, already walking away, "from someone qualified." That evening, Daniel picked Mia up from her after-school program, and she chattered the entire car ride home about a science project involving baking soda and vinegar, and he listened and laughed in the right places and said nothing about his day. But that night, after she was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table for a long time, with the metal box from his closet open in front of him, looking at documents he hadn't touched in years, and did not open his laptop, and did not make any calls. Not yet. 3 days later, Frank called him into the office again, this time visibly upset. "She's filed a formal complaint, says you're unprofessional, says the tone of your reports has been hostile, says she wants a different consultant on the account going forward." "That's her right." "Daniel, I have to be honest with you. This could affect your standing here. This is a 6-figure contract." Daniel nodded slowly. He thought about how many times over the past 4 years he had absorbed exactly this kind of moment, quietly, for Mia, for stability, for a life he had built on purpose to be small and steady and unremarkable, because unremarkable had felt like the only kind of life he had the strength left to carry. But there is a difference between choosing quiet and being erased, and Daniel was beginning, for the first time in a long while, to feel the edges of that difference. "Let it play out, Frank," he said. "I have a meeting to prepare a report for. It'll clarify things." He didn't say which meeting. The meeting Vanessa had requested to resolve this once and for all was scheduled for the following Tuesday, in the same conference room where she'd first called Daniel's watch cute. She'd invited her leadership team, the building's property management liaison, and, because she wanted, she told Priya, someone with actual authority in the room this time, a representative from the ownership group that held the building's parent company, Halden Bright Holdings. Vanessa had done a little digging over the weekend and found that Halden Bright Holdings had recently and quietly acquired the property management company Daniel worked for, folding it into a broader portfolio of building services companies. She assumed, reasonably enough by her logic, that someone from corporate would side with her, a paying client, over a facilities consultant she'd already decided was in over his head. She did not know that Halden Bright Holdings had been founded 11 years earlier by a structural engineer who, after a difficult and painful chapter of his life, restructured the company to run almost entirely through delegated leadership so that he could scale back his public role and raise his daughter without cameras, headlines, or a life that required a different version of himself at every dinner. She did not know his name, because he had made sure, deliberately and for years, that very few people did. The conference room filled up. Vanessa stood at the head of the table with her printout, the complaint she intended to formally lodge, plus a competing report from a consultant she'd hired independently, one who had, unsurprisingly, found nothing wrong with the wall. The door opened. Daniel walked in. Same gray jacket, same $11 watch, and took the seat that had been left open at the far end of the table, the seat, it turned out, reserved for the ownership representative. Vanessa blinked. "I'm sorry, where's the person from Halden Bright?" "You're looking at him," Daniel said, setting his folder down. "I own Halden Bright Holdings. I founded it. I'm also, as it happens, the person who wrote your facilities report." The room went very still. "That's," Vanessa let out a short laugh, the kind people use when they're trying to find solid ground. "That's not. I looked you up. Community college. No presence anywhere. You're a consultant." "I have a degree in structural engineering. I finished it at a community college because it was cheaper and the professors were better than the ones at the university I could have gone to instead. And then I finished a graduate degree somewhere you would recognize, which I don't advertise because it has never once made me better at my job. I still do the walkthroughs myself sometimes. I like being on site. I like knowing what's actually happening in the buildings my company is responsible for, instead of just reading summaries from people who might be inclined to make problems disappear for a client." Vanessa's independent report was still in her hand. It suddenly looked very thin. "The wall," Daniel continued, "is a genuine hazard. I flagged it because it's my job to flag it, and because the consultant you hired to contradict me either missed it or chose not to see it, and I'd be very curious which. The electrical panel is a code violation, regardless of who's reading the code. Those facts don't change based on the size of the client, or what I wear to a walkthrough, or where I went to school." "You could have said something," Vanessa said, and her voice had lost its edge entirely now, gone thin and disbelieving. "Any of the times. I could have," Daniel agreed. "I generally don't lead with it. It tends to change how people treat me, and I've found I learn more about a person's character when they don't know who I am." He let that sit for a second, not cruelly, just honestly. "You called my watch cute in front of clients. You told a room full of people you'd feel more confident in my findings if I had, I believe your words were, a little more behind me. I want to be clear that none of that is why we're having this conversation. We're having this conversation because there's a wall in this building that could fail, and a panel that could start a fire, and a report that's been sitting unaddressed for 3 weeks while you tried to find someone to tell you what you wanted to hear."
The fallout, when it came, wasn't dramatic. Daniel made sure of that. He wasn't interested in ruining anyone. He was interested in the wall getting fixed and the truth being visible, and those two things turned out to be closely related. Howden Bright Holdings, through its property management arm, sent Cole and Vance a formal notice. The lease renewal, scheduled for the following spring, would require the structural and electrical issues to be resolved according to the original report, no revisions, no reframing, before the agency could remain in the building. Vanessa's independent consultant, once Daniel's engineering team reviewed his findings, was quietly removed from Howden Bright's approved vendor list. It turned out he hadn't missed the wall issue at all. He'd been told by Vanessa, off the record, what conclusion she needed him to reach. Vanessa herself was not fired, not humiliated, not run out of business. Daniel made a point of that, telling Frank plainly that he had no interest in destroying a woman's company over an $80,000 repair and some bad manners, however sharp they'd been. But she did lose something quieter and, in its way, more lasting. The leadership team, who had watched the entire exchange in that conference room, no longer looked at her quite the same way. Two of her senior staff, including Priya, requested transfers to other accounts within the month. The story of the meeting made its way, as these things do, around the building's tenant network, not because Daniel told anyone, but because 11 people had been in that room. Priya, for her part, received a call from Daniel a week later, not about Vanessa, but about a facilities coordinator position opening up within Howden Bright's own property team. "You checked on the contractor when I asked you to," he told her. "That's rarer than it should be." Vanessa called Daniel's office twice in the weeks after, asking to speak with him directly. He took the second call. "I owe you an apology," she said, and to her credit, she said it plainly, without excuses stitched into it. "I don't know if that means anything at this point." "It means something," Daniel said. "Fix the wall. That's the part that actually matters to me." The wall was fixed within 3 weeks. Word of the confrontation traveled further than Daniel expected, in the low-key way these things do among people who run buildings and manage properties. Not headlines, nothing that would have interested a reporter, just a shift in how people spoke to him. Frank, apologetic and a little sheepish, asked if Daniel wanted to reconsider his role at the consulting firm, maybe step into something with more visibility. "I like the walkthroughs," Daniel told him. "I'm not looking to stop doing them." He did, however, make one change. He stopped hiding quite so much. Not dramatically, no press, no public reveal, nothing that would have disrupted the quiet architecture of his and Mia's life, but he started answering, when people asked, with the truth instead of a deflection. He hung the diploma. He didn't buy a new watch. There was, as it happened, a small and unhurried thread running alongside all of it. A woman named Claire, who managed the building 2 floors up from Cole and Vance, and Daniel had gotten to know over the months of walkthroughs, long before any of this happened, over shared coffee in the stairwell and a mutual habit of noticing things other people missed. She had liked him before she knew anything about Howden Bright, had teased him gently about the truck and the watch in a way that never once had an edge to it, and when the story eventually reached her, she just laughed and said, "Well, that explains the way you read every lease like it owes you money." "Force of habit," Daniel said. "Good habit to keep, I think." They started having dinner on Thursdays. Mia approved of her almost immediately, mostly on the strength of Claire's opinion that baking soda volcanoes were, and she quoted this directly, criminally underrated as a science project.
6 months later, on an ordinary Tuesday evening, Daniel stood at the kitchen counter making dinner, while Mia sat at the table, swinging her feet, narrating an elaborate story about a classmate's hamster that had apparently escaped during show and tell. And then it ran under Mrs. Alvarez's desk, and she screamed, and it was the best day of school ever, Mia said, entirely satisfied with this outcome. "Sounds like it," Daniel said, sliding a plate in front of her. "Dad," she looked at his wrist, where the same scratched $11 watch still sat, unchanged. "Are you ever going to get a new watch, now that you're like a secret rich person?" Daniel considered this with the seriousness the question deserved. "I'm not a secret anymore, And no, this one still works. That's a very boring answer. I've been told that before. From the living room, Claire called out that the timer for the garlic bread had gone off, and Mia hopped down to go supervise, already narrating a new, entirely fictional development in the hamster saga to anyone who'd listen. Daniel checked the watch, force of habit, nothing more, and went to go pull dinner out of the oven in a kitchen that was still small, in a life that had never needed to be anything else.